Kat's case, and that was our next topic.
Oh, really? Okay.
That's a complicated case, but maybe just give a little background. You described that as your baby, and it came right in the midst. It came to a head in the midst of the free speech movement.
Well, no, it actually preceded it in some respects. It just so happened a very good friend of mine who was a professor at UC San Diego called me up one day and told me that a guy was and knew my views. He had same views. He's a Jewish background, same attitude. We knew each other more or less as graduate students. And he called me up and says a guy is being fired in Berkeley in the German department. Can you help him? And being a wise guy, I said, sure, I can help him. He says, what makes you so confident? I said, because I've been involved in so many cases, and every one of them I did something wrong. There can't be anything left that would be wrong. So whatever I do now is bound to be right. So he says, okay. So within minutes, this man Katz, Eli Katz, his name was, he was an acting assistant professor, I think, in the German department, was in my office describing the case. And it turned out he obviously came from a background which involved communist activities, either his parents or himself or both. And we talked for a while. He was being supported very effectively by his department. And he had signed a loyalty oath, and they wanted to terminate him. And they were not going to charge him with perjury, which is the way I thought they should proceed. If they want to charge him with perjury, that would be horrible to have somebody who perjures himself as a faculty member at the university. So the Katz case developed. So I immediately called Tenbrook, even though our contacts would go on and off depending on the issues. For years we wouldn't talk to each other, and then he'd call me or I'd call him. And so he immediately said, let's get together and talk about it. So we talked about it, and we invited Frank Newman, who later became the dean of the law school and then later became a justice in the Supreme Court of the state of California. And the three of us decided that we would no longer do what we used to do, which was go to the university administration and plead our case and argue with them, because they immediately co-opted you. I mean,
that you'd experienced that in the past?
Oh, yes, absolutely. They opened the desk drawer and say, Howard, look at this file, or something of that sort. And in fact, that's what Ed Strong did on another issue with me, and he had Alex Sheriffs in the room because he wouldn't meet with me alone. And I said, Ed, you can close the drawer. I'm not interested in what's in the FBI file because I don't believe a word of it. So it was clear I wouldn't deal with them on this. But on this issue, we just didn't even talk to them about it. Instead, we immediately called Ernie Bessick of the ACLU, and he got heavily involved. So the Katz case was rolling along, and can't remember each detail, but essentially he was terminated. And we kept protesting this over and over and over again. And then finally, John Kelly, who was in the math department, came into the picture. He was head of the AAUP. AAUP, ordinarily, I'm a great supporter of AAUP throughout the United States, American Association of University Professors. But in Berkeley, it didn't amount to very much because the Academic Senate was the dominant vehicle for faculty to express their views and fight for academic freedom and positions. So AAUP was sort of a perfunctory organization, but John Kelly did his best and he decided he would get involved. So he started talking to Clark Kerr, who by that time I guess was president, no longer chancellor. And then Kelly had this conversation with him, and Kelly then said, I understand these are the terms in which that Eli Katz can have his position back. And he wrote this in a letter to Kerr, and Kerr did it in his characteristic fashion, what he usually does in these things. He wrote around the periphery of this letter in a scroll that only his assistants could read, his version of the agreement, 5 points or something of that particular sort. And I got a copy of that, either from Katz or from John Kelly, I can't remember whom. So I knew everything there was to know about I call that a blackmail letter.
Kind of an agreement?
Yes. If you do this, we will reappoint you. If you will name this. And it was a typical letter.
What Katz had to do.
And Clark Kerr, of course, was a master at negotiations. That was his field. But this was, in my opinion, a disgraceful position. He maintained to me many years later that he was fighting for Katz because he had to clarify this with the Board of Regents. Well, there's a limit. Fortunately, I was never a university president, so I don't have to put on his hat, and I didn't put on his hat. So I disagree with him completely on this. When I read that letter on the floor of the Academic Senate, Katz is long gone, and we had continually brought the issue up to the Committee on Academic Freedom. Every couple of meetings they would report no progress. I think by that time, well, Meyerson wasn't yet the acting chancellor. I think Strong was still chancellor. So I then introduced so Tenbrook and I and Newman got together, and it was agreed that we would, at an academic senate meeting, I would give a speech and give the history of this thing, and then introduce a resolution, which was to censure the chancellor of the Berkeley campus and the president of the university over this issue. And I got up and gave this speech. It was just October, I think, of the year the FSM was building up before 64. The famous December meeting. And the place had about 500 faculty members present rather than the 50 or 60 that are usually present. There was frequently they didn't have a quota. And you could hear a pin drop. And when I gave this speech, I gave this motion, and then Tenbrook, who was sitting right behind me with a cardboard box in front of him where he had his Braille speech, would give the seconding speech. And it went on that way, and then there are a few feeble comments, one of whom which was from Rubley Williams, my department chair, trying to defend the administration. It didn't get very far. And then Robert Gordon said, would you mind an amendment for their handling of the Katz case? And I looked back at Tenbrook, and he says, Howie, what are you going to do? I said, it sounds fine with me. I'm not censuring him for the parking rules. I'm censuring him for their handling of the Katz case. So we accepted the amendment without a vote, and it passed by a 3-1, a huge margin.
Now, do you attribute that to the faculty being upset about how the administration was handling FSM also?
Well, it might have been. I mean, it's certainly the liberal the College of Letters and Science faculty were out. I mean, that's what's so fundamental about the university. The College of Engineering professors hardly ever came to a Senate meeting, and professional schools in general didn't come to meetings, and the heart of the university was L&S. And they were there in full bloom because they were interested. They were doing more teaching than anybody else. Their relationship with students were greater. So they were there. I think it was the beginning of the free speech movement at that particular time. The Katz case had started much earlier, but by the time I gave my speech, it was FSM that was drawing the crowd. Nobody knew that I was going to give a speech on the floor of the Academic Senate, except for Tenbrook and Frank Newman. So that evening, I got invited to a meeting, I think at Steve Smale's house, where there were about 30 liberal faculty members. Most of them never heard of me before. And
well, were some of them this loyalty oath crowd, though?
No, very few of them were that. It was a new crowd. These were the younger people, I think, by and large. Steve Smale certainly didn't date back to the loyalty oath. I'm pretty sure he didn't. There were some, I mean. But so that's how I got involved with FSM. But it was primarily because of my activity with regard to Katz. And the Katz case went on for a long time. And then Meyerson, Katz was hired by Western Reserve. He was an assistant professor in Cleveland. And finally, Meyerson went ahead with a lot of courage and rehired him in the German department here as an assistant professor.
Which must have been difficult because, again, it was the regents were watching this campus very closely.
Oh, that's certainly right.
Yeah.
And I was heavily involved with, I think I might have mentioned in the other interview, with the appointment of Leon Wofsy at that particular time.
You did, yeah.
So
yeah.
that...
Two appointments.
That was going on at
Leon
the same time.
Wofsy lasted
Leon Wofsy
longer.
was in my field, so there I was the expert of his science, and I probably knew more about that work than anybody else on the campus. So that was a fascinating case, and they were going on simultaneously. Yeah. And it was at that time when I went to see Ed Strong and over why are you holding up this appointment, because it was recommended. I was the head of the committee, the appointment committee created by the budget committee, and I went to see Strong what's going on with this appointment, and that's when he opened the desk drawer, had the sheriff sitting there, and I indicated I didn't want to hear anything about it. So with a great deal of difficulty, Leon Wofsy was appointed to the faculty. But again, it was the same issue. Charge him with perjury or not, and they were afraid to do that because they might lose. but yet they were convinced that he was a communist. But all he said was, "I have not been a communist for the past 5 years," and that's relatively easy to check. You could have been a communist 10 years earlier and left, and yet they still had this lingering fear. We don't want to appoint any communists to the faculty.